So the American Navy is about 4.5 gigawatts of power. So that's the power that's backing the dollar, 4.5 gigawatts. The Bitcoin network has a computer network that uses power as well. And it's using about 10 gigawatts of power.
Wow.
So if the dollar is backed by 4.5 in the Navy, well, Bitcoin's backed by 10. Okay. Well, that's the power. What's using the power? Well, computers. So computers are measured in hash power. And if you take all the cloud hosting platforms like Microsoft Azure and Amazon AWS, et cetera, and you take all the hash power of those, you would call it equihash. And then you compare that to the computing power of the Bitcoin network. The Bitcoin network has 10 times the amount of computer hash power that all the other computer power has in the world.
Hello and welcome to Bitcoin with Jake. This is a podcast all about people's personal journeys to Bitcoin. I wanted to know more about the people converging on this new form of money. Why do they see value in it? What skills enable their understanding? How is it changing their lives? If you're a founder looking for funding or an investor looking to make investments, then please reach out as I develop my network in the space. Do me a favor and chuck us a 5-star rating on whichever app you're using to listen, or a like if you're watching it somewhere. As insignificant as this may seem, they help a startup project like this hugely. Lastly, if you have any questions at all, please just reach out. The easiest place to find me is on Twitter at Jake E.S. Woodhouse. Now, I'd like to take a quick moment to talk about our sponsor. Fast Bitcoins are a Bitcoin exchange who you should definitely take a look at next time you're thinking of making a Bitcoin purchase. They're a great team, which for me is always the key to due diligence, whilst their product has a ton of features useful to every Bitcoiner. Check out my episodes with Danny Brewster, the founder CEO, and Nathan Smith, the Chief Compliance Officer, to learn more about the people behind the brand. Thank you to Fast Bitcoins for sponsoring the show. Now, on to today's episode. Today I'm speaking with Mark Moss. Welcome, Mark.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jake. Happy to be back talking to you.
Thank you so much for joining, and shout out to Jigsy and Maddie, who we did our first episode with together a year or so ago from now. But today on my own and focus just on the Bitcoin space. So in this podcast, I'd like to understand people's personal journeys to Bitcoin and why it's important to them and when they got involved. So let's start there. At some stage, you came across this asset and you go, okay, wow, this is interesting. I need to take a look at it. Could you think back to when that was and why was it so interesting at the time? Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe you said, I don't like it.
No, sure. I mean, my journey somewhat kind of ends, or the beginning and the end kind of culminates somewhere where yours did as well. But we'll start backwards. So I think ultimately, in today's day and age, with the way the political parties have shifted so hard to one side that over the last 2 years, in Australia or in the United States, where it's woken a lot of people up. And so a lot of people are so-called red-pilled these days. For me, I think I was like always red-pilled. And so my parents are grassroots conservatives. And so politics is still discussed around our table, right? So that's just kind of the way it is. So I wasn't one of those people that was red-pilled. I was just always red-pilled, I guess, in today's terms. My grandfather was a Purple Heart recipient, World War II vet. My father flew jets in Vietnam. I was born into a military family. And I just kind of grew up that way. I just thought that I would go to war one day and, patriotic and all those things. So I think understanding that ideology is a little bit helpful. I'm not going to go through my whole backstory, but let's just say I started investing into these weird things that nobody knew anything about. These crazy things were called internet stocks. It was in the late 90s. And me and my roommate had quit his job at the time. We're trading these things and people thought we were crazy talking about these weird things called internet stocks, which is an interesting parallel maybe we'll come back to. But then the whole .com thing blew up. And then in 2001, I had this great idea. In 1999, I had this great idea to start an internet business, a .com business, and that we were going to get super rich. And I'm in California, where Silicon Valley and all that. And it was a slam dunk, and the market crashed. Like, we were already raising money, we were on our way there, and the whole thing fell apart. In 2001, I had this bright idea to start an internet business, an e-commerce business, selling stuff online. And I had people laugh at me and say, nobody would ever buy anything online. And I'm like, okay, well, I think they will. And I built this website and I want to sell your products. And they said, we don't even want our products being sold on the internet. So I lived through that. And then I managed to grow the business and, I have a Fortune 500 exit. So the reason why I say that is I was involved in tech, let's say the internet and tech for a long time. And so then I kind of got more into the marketing world. When I launched my first e-commerce business in 2001, there was no way to advertise online because there was no one online to advertise to. But as I built that business, I learned about internet marketing. And so I was kind of in this intersection of, marketing and, internet or whatever. And Well, let's just flashback real quick. So I had a couple businesses, Fortune 500 exit. I developed $25 million in real estate from the ground up. Like I said, 2 high value exits of businesses, one in a medical equipment service company, one in an internet business company. I made a lot of money. By the time I was 30 years old, I was retired. I had my first kid. I had this mansion I built overlooking the beach, and I was done, like tapped out, game over. I achieved everything I wanted in life. And then 2008 came and I got wiped out. In California, real estate, where I was in California, real estate dropped 60% in 12 months. As a matter of fact, this building that I'm recording from is one of the buildings that did me in. This building that I'm in right now, I was selling this building for $12 million. I had turned down an offer for $11 million because I thought I could get what I was closer to what I was asking. And it ended up going back to the bank. The bank sold it for 4. Fuck. From 12 to 4. And now I'm leasing from them today. And I say that because what happened is, and that's an important piece of the story, because what happened is I was really good at making money. I had multiple businesses, high value exits, real estate, internet, all that stuff. But what I didn't know was this financial casino that was going on. And it had all this power and control over my life. I was good at making money. I was good at building businesses and hiring employees and providing value to the marketplace. I was good at that. But I didn't understand there was this financial system that had all this power and control over me, and I wasn't paying attention to it. And so, anyway, that sucked. I lost everything and had to start over. And, I had to figure that all out. Growing up racing dirt bikes, I've broken most of my bones. I have metal in all my joints. I just had my 8th major surgery. So I'm just used to like, okay, let me try that again.
Dust yourself off and carry on. Yeah.
Dust myself off. This is never going to happen to me again. So I got to go figure this out. And so since then, since 2008, I've spent the majority of my time focusing on central bank policy and, politics and central bank policy. Because I realized that is, I still handle my business stuff, of course, but I spend all my time focusing on the big macro picture because that has so much power and control. So that's kind of where I was 2008, 9, 10. All of a sudden, I became a gold bug. I realized it was the fiat money system was the root of all this. And so if we had a sound money system, it could solve it. And so I was listening to Mike Maloney and Peter Schiff, and I became a gold bug. I remember, it was probably 2011, 2012, Bitcoin kind of came across my radar. Being in internet and money and tech, I was kind of in that space, and it kind of came across my plate. And it was just like, oh, this new like tech thing, and I could put money into it, and the price was going up like crazy. And I was gonna buy some, and then in 2013 the price came crashing down, and I was like, oh well, I'm glad I didn't put money into that. But I never really paid any attention to it. I didn't really think about what it was. I was going through, there was a newsletter that I subscribed to called Sovereign Man. He still writes the newsletter today. I highly recommend it to anybody. And it's all about, you wouldn't put all your money into one stock. So why would you have your whole life in one country? And so why not have multiple flags, flag theory, if you will, right? International diversification, whatever you want to call it. And I was like, yes, of course. Like I was afraid. And as most people that were around, we all thought there was another banking crisis coming. Like most people that were involved in it, none of the problems from 2008 got fixed. In 2011, 12, like I was still expecting another crash to happen. And so I was like, I need to get money out of the banking system. The banking system is fragile. And I was in the process of going through with one of his attorneys in Panama to open up a trust in Panama and a bank account. And if I put money in the bank account, I could work on a path to citizenship. And I wanted to get a passport. I want to get money out of the banking system. So it's 2015. And I was talking to an attorney. I set up an appointment. I was supposed to go visit him in 2015 to go sign the paperwork and get the process going. And I took another look at Bitcoin. And I was like, wait a minute, this is the exact same thing. I'm getting money out of the banking system. And so I ended up buying Bitcoin. It was around $300 at the time. And at the time, like I said, the whole thought process was this is just a way to get it outside the bank and outside the hands of the government. So that was what I bought it for at the time. Originally, when I first saw it, like I said, I bought it because I saw it was going up, number go up, NGU, right? But when I took another look at it in 2015, it was because I was trying to get money out of the hands of the reach of the state, right? So that's what I bought it for. But as I started, you put a little bit of skin in the game, you start paying attention to it. And I just realized like, actually, this is a tool that we can actually win with. Like, wait a minute, we actually have hope now. Because remember, fiat system was the demise and I became a gold bug and all those things, right? But the problem is gold just isn't going to ever work. And so while I became a gold bug and while I preached that sound money was the way to go, I just knew that it just wasn't really practical. And when I finally got Bitcoin, I was like, this is it. We have a tool. Now we can win. And when that clicked for me, I'm like, I got to go tell everybody I know about this. And of course I did. And so I've kind of been making content for Bitcoin and crypto since 2016. I say and crypto because, I'm not really ashamed to say, but in 2016, I fell into the crypto rabbit hole. And, being a tech guy and understand how it works and understanding market cycles and all these things, in 2016, Bitcoin wasn't as clear cut of a winner. At least I didn't see it that way at the time. And, like I said, I'm not ashamed. It was part of my process. Or maybe I'm a little ashamed, but I kind of got into the blockchain, not Bitcoin kind of thing. And I started writing a cryptocurrency research newsletter from 2016 through 2019. Mm-hmm. So 4 years of putting out research on every single project. Each month I'd put out 20, 25 pages of privacy coins and decentralized exchanges and you name it, right? So over that 4-year period, I put out about 1,000 pages of research that I did into the ecosystem. And finally, in 2019, I had a partner at the time. And in 2019, I just said, you know what? All of this is just vaporware. I've done the research. I've put the time. I've looked at every project and I just don't want to be involved in it anymore. And my then partner at the time, I just said, hey, look, like we had a really good business. It was making a lot of money. I said, look, I don't want to do this anymore. I made him an offer he couldn't refuse. So good. He was like, yes, within a week, he cut me a check and I was out. And so I decided I just want to focus on Bitcoin and macro. And so since 2019, I've been focused on Bitcoin and macro. And I like that story and I'm not ashamed by it. And the reason why I say that is because a lot of times people say, oh, Bitcoin maxis, you haven't done the research. You don't understand, blah, blah, blah. I've done the research. I've published 1,000 pages of research, right? So I came to it through a journey of having to discover that. And so anyway, that's my story.
That's brilliant, Mark. Thank you for sharing all that. The truth is we are the sum of all our parts, and those parts are experiences that we gain at different times from different things. And it's through ups, downs, happy and low moments that we kind of evolve. And so for me, for example, when I'm looking at making an allocation into Bitcoin, it's like, well, who's buying Bitcoin and why are they buying it? And so the last 10 minutes you just explaining that is unbelievable due diligence for me to leverage and say, okay, well, Mark's been and done all this work for 5 years in the crypto space, but even before that, seasoned veteran at building and selling businesses. That's not someone who I'm going to mistrust straight away. Quite the opposite, in fact. So yeah, it's a very, very exciting moment when you're starting, oh, this is really what I want to focus on. What intrigues me is what were some of the hardest parts that you had to kind of unlearn during this process? So it's one of the things I found most difficult is we're so conditioned to think in a certain way. Yeah. Would you have any comments to that? So, obviously you decided to walk away from the crypto research thing to focus just on Bitcoin. Maybe that was a moment, or anything else that springs to mind for that?
I think the thing to unlearn, or not really learn, but I don't know if I'd say unlearn it, but maybe I kind of had to rethink about, and something I talk about all the time is like, when you're investing, when you're giving up your money for something else, you need to figure out what is it that I'm trying to do? And not just with money, with your time, with anything you're doing. Like, what am I trying to do? What am I buying? What am I buying it for? And what am I expecting from this? So for example, I'm buying this apartment because I don't expect it to go up in value. It's not going to appreciate, but it generates a good amount of cash flow. And I think it's going to continue to generate cash flow because it's around these key areas that I think are going to have good long-term demand. So I'm buying it for cash flow, not for appreciation. And I'm expecting it to maintain its cash flow for a long period of time because of these factors. So I'm understanding what it is that I'm buying and what I'm buying it for. Right. And so going back to like a crypto example would be kind of the same thing. So if I was going to buy a crypto asset, what am I buying it for? And what am I expecting from it? Well, most likely I would be buying it, or when I was recommending it, buying it, I was buying it to make more USD. Right. I was saying, well, if I buy it here, then I can speculate that it will be worth more in the future and I can get more US dollars. And maybe, I think I see the news cycle and I see it's this new project that's getting pumped and it has these advisors. And if I get in here, I bet you within the next 6 months when it pumps, I can get out here. Right. So it's all speculation. Whereas I think the behind Bitcoin is completely different. As I told you, it was like, we finally have a tool we can win with. Like we're buying Bitcoin for completely different reasons.
Go on, Mark. So let's really highlight that then. So perhaps what did you see as the main struggle? And when you say we can win with, like, what is the battle that you're going to win as a result of being able to learn and buy Bitcoin?
Well, the battle that we can win, I framed this up on a podcast with Peter McCormick, What Bitcoin Did. We just recorded the third part of the trilogy, but the first one was titled "The Battle for the Fate of Humanity."
Mm. Yeah,
And
I've listened to it. That's excellent.
that's what we can win with, right? So to frame it up for your listeners, I believe an analogy is if you're old enough to have watched the original Star Wars movie. And in Star Wars, it's the rebels fighting against the Empire. And the Empires had their Death Star, which was like their spaceship, right? And at the end of the movie, Luke Skywalker had to fly in with his rebels. And the goal was to blow up the Death Star. And they had to go into this channel and he had to fly through this channel. And at the end was like this red beacon or whatever. And he had to drop his missiles right there. And if he could blow up that one spot, then the whole Death Star falls apart and the whole Empire crumbled. Which he did. He was able to land the missiles there, pull out, the Death Star fall apart, and then whatever. I believe that red part to get rid of the Empire is the money printer. That's the attack vector. That's what we have to get rid of. And so, just like Luke Skywalker had to fly his jet in and launch a missile to take it out, I believe the way that we beat the money printer is with Bitcoin. So I believe that the money printer is the source of all their power. It's what allows them to do everything from forcing people to take medicine and lock them in their homes to pushing ESG mandates to, going to war with Ukraine, you name it. The source of all that power and the source of, I believe, every problem in the world or almost every problem in the world comes from that money printer. And I believe there's just only one option to defeat that. Now, like I said, I thought it was gold, but really gold isn't the option. And so really I believe there's only one tool, and that's Bitcoin.
And I heard you once talk about a brilliant analogy, which was if you look at the tree outside, you see all the leaves on the tree. They're all the problems that we exist in day-to-day life. And if you go to the bottom of that tree, you find the root system, and that root is the money printer. So could you bring to life that analogy, and what are some of the problems that we see on day-to-day life that you think are exacerbated by money printers? You touched on it a little bit then in terms of war or in terms of, medical, recommendations or whatever the case might be. What are some of those problems you see?
Yeah. Well, a big problem that we have is that people can't really think anymore. People don't understand the nuance of things, and they really don't take the time to think through a complete thought process into second, third, fourth, fifth order thinking. So that would be like, okay, then what? So, hey, gas prices are really high. The state should give people money to offset those high expenses. Well, that sounds like a good idea. Those people need help. So why don't we just give them money? Okay, but then what happens? Well, where do we get the money from? Well, we have to go into more debt. If we go into more debt, then what happens? Well, then we have to print more money. And then what happens? Well, then it debases all the rest of the money. And then what happens? Well, then prices go up. And then what happens? Well, then families can't afford it. And then what happens? Well, instead of one person working, two people have to work. And then what happens? Well, now they don't have any time for their relationships. So then what happens? Well, then we have divorce rate. And then what happens? Well, then kids don't have proper households. Okay, then what happens? Well, then kids grow up without proper role models. And then what happens? Well, then we have a lawless society. And then what happens? Right? Like, think through that, right? And most people just haven't really thought through that. I make videos. I try to take these like huge master classes and reduce them down to 20 minutes. And some people are like, dude, couldn't you have just said that in 5 minutes? I'm like, dude, I could say it in a headline. I could just give you the headline if you want, right? But like, how do you unpack that? And so it's in society today, we see people wanting to kind of rush through that, not think through that. So I gave you an example. Why do we have such a rise of crime today? Well, I just gave you 10 steps of how the money printer caused that. Right. So like, why is obesity such a big problem? Well, because we don't have good role models in families. Well, why do we have that? Well, because people are working. Why do we have that? Well, because costs are so expensive. What are we doing about that? Well, now food companies have to make food cheaper to offset the expenses. So what happens when they do that? Well, they make stuff cheaper, so they use worse ingredients. Well, when they make worse ingredients, then what happens? Well, then it makes us sick. And then if that happens, then what happens? Then the medical system breaks down. And then, like, you know what I mean? So it's like, we could sit there and draw, I believe, like you said, that tree analogy, we could take every problem and trace it back if we thought long enough. And I think most people think about it from an economic standpoint, which it certainly is. So, and I could sit here all day, war, for example, right? Typically on a sound money system, we didn't have wars as often because if I was going to go to war, I'd have to spend real money. And if I lost, I would lose it all. And so then even if we did have wars would be very, very short.
Mhm.
But on a fiat money system where we just create money, we go to war all the time and we're in wars forever. We were in war with Afghanistan for 20 years, right? Like spent $2 trillion. If we had to actually spend real money, we wouldn't have spent $2 trillion on that. So, we can think of wars and then what happens if we have wars and what does that do to society, right? And so typically we think about it from like an economic standpoint, but I even like to think about it from a standpoint of tearing down society. And so we can blame the obesity problem. The number one cause of death in the United States is heart disease. Obesity. Well, why is obesity? Well, I already explained the food, but why the food? Well, because of the money system, right? And we can talk about the incarceration rate in the United States. Why is the incarceration rate so high? Well, it's because of the money, right? And so we could like take almost every problem from an economic standpoint, but also from a societal standpoint. And I believe we could trace them almost all back to the money.
And it's where your work, dissecting issues and taking complexity and putting it into a 20-minute YouTube video, I think is absolutely excellent. And I found myself recently, I was going through a phase of putting podcasts or YouTube videos on 1.5x speed.
Yeah.
And I was like, actually, hang on, what am I doing here? I want to learn what is being spoken about. And so I dialed that back. I was like, listen to it in real time, try and actually kind of concentrate on what's being said. And that in a sense has helped, but it's a good analogy as to how like society is so frantic, so fast. There's not enough time to do anything. And that phrase of fix the money, fix the world, like the first time I started looking at time preference and what is sound money, it all starts to kind of click into place. And when you're using a corrupted monetary system to run everything is by default corrupted. And it's just an infinitely interesting conversation.
I love that piece right there. So think about, you said corrupted monetary system. So I think that today the world is waking up to the fact that we have real evil.
Mm.
And, I get asked all the time, these leaders, are they ignorant or are they evil? I think there's both. I think most people are just ignorant. I think education has really failed people, but I think there's also evil. And so if we take a look at evil, a lot of times people would say that I like to make the case that tools are neutral. So a screwdriver I could use to fix my car, or I could hurt somebody with a screwdriver, right? It's a tool.
A
A
knife
gun
could be used for cooking, or you
a
could stab
knife or
someone.
a gun or a car. I mean, any of those things could be used a car could use to get me to somewhere I need to go, or I could hurt people with a car too, right?
Mm.
And so they're tools. And so most people look at money as a tool that's neutral. Money can be used for good. I can go help people. Money can be used for bad. I could use it to fund terrorism, right? So money is neutral. It's a tool, could be used for good or bad. But I don't believe that's the case. Well, let me say, I don't believe fiat is a neutral tool. Money, whatever, gold, okay, money is neutral. Fiat money or fiat currency, people like to get into the semantics of this. I think it's a little bit too into the weeds. But what we call money, currency, fiat currency specifically, is not a neutral tool. So fiat is a system built on theft. Inflation is theft. It's built on lies, and it's built on deceit. And so anything that's built on a fiat monetary system is inherently evil.
Wow. And
Now,
the fun thing about stating something like that is the majority of people I know will go, oh, what are you talking about? You can't say that. And yeah, sorry, I cut you off a second, but go on.
yeah, so I think because fiat money is a system of theft and lies and deceit, that's what it incentivizes. It incentivizes theft, lies, and deceit. We know that I've quoted often Vladimir Lenin from the USSR. He said that the best way to destroy capitalism would be to debauch the currency, destroy the currency through inflation. And through inflation, they could arbitrarily inflate and confiscate wealth. And then he goes on to say a bunch more. And at the end, he says, through a series of inflation, the relation to money will be so lost that the best way to gain wealth will be through gambling and theft. And if the cryptocurrency market isn't gambling, I don't know what it is. And if FTX and all of that isn't theft, then I don't know what is. If what those VCs were doing in that space was not theft, then I don't know what is. So Vladimir Lenin was right. It was theft. And I can explain that. I have firsthand knowledge into FTX and Alameda. But so basically through the fiat money system, it destroyed capitalism. They used inflation to artificially confiscate arbitrarily. And then the best way to get wealth in a system like today is through theft and deceit. gambling and theft, right? And so that shows it's an inherently evil system that creates inherently evil actions. Now,
Brilliantly put.
if we contrast that with Bitcoin, Bitcoin is a system built on trust or truth, transparency. So not lies and deceit, but trust and transparency, not built on lies, but built on truth.
Yeah,
Now, I don't know the audience who wants, they're different worlds. Now, in the Bible, or if you want, in the spiritual world, or good and evil, or biblical, or God, or devil, or whatever you want to look at it, in the Bible, it calls the devil the father of lies. That's what he's called. His tool, the devil's only tool, is deceit. God is called truth. Just contrast the two. Now, whether you believe in God or not, I mean, that's up to you. But I think, to me, however you want to look at it, the contrasts are there. And so I think that's what's wrong with the monetary system, the fiat monetary system. And I think until we get off of that system, we're just never going to have a good, economy or environment or market ever again.
And again, I'd like to, applaud you for the work you're doing, educating people about this and the way that you actually do it in terms of extremely engaging content and YouTube and all the rest of it. So as someone like myself who's aspiring to build a business out of a podcast, it's fascinating to see what you're doing. One thing I'd like to draw to, you talk about capitalism, you talk about communism. I recently read your book, The UnCommunist Manifesto. And it's interesting in that I'm aware of the discussion about different types of political ideology, and that's something that I have studied at different times, but it's only later in life now that I'm really starting to dig into what they mean and what are things that I affiliate with. And frankly, learning about Bitcoin has unearthed this whole world of libertarianism and Austrian economics, which I was never ever even told was an option. Frankly, it's quite incredible. But what I loved in the UnCommunist Manifesto was the way that you first you defined what these terms actually were, and then dissected what was so kind of clearly retarded in what is the original Communist Manifesto. So I encourage everyone out there who's listening to get this book and have a read of it. But what I'd like to talk through is this idea that capitalism is actually a form of nature. And that was what I really took away from the book. So could you talk to people about, why did you decide to get together with Alex and write the book, and equally really expose what you meant by, capitalism is actually nature rather than a type of political sphere?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. And shout out to my co-author, Alex Fetsky, and the book, UnCommunist Manifesto. It's on Amazon. So I think that's one of the points that I'm really proud of in the book. And, capitalism is a word that has a very dirty connotation, potentially. Today we think it's greed, it's slavery, it's, all these corporations, et cetera. And it's a word that I had found myself not using. And I was trying to kind of use more like free markets, which I thought were more descriptive. And it was actually my co-author, Alex Fetsky, who said, no, let's dig in and let's bring that word. Let's make capitalism great again, so to speak, right? And so what we did is we started the book out with those definitions, as you said. And the reason why is because I believe so many words are misunderstood today. And we use words wrong so much now that they've lost their meaning, right? So calling someone a racist or a scammer, all of a sudden, are they really a racist or a scammer? Or are you just throwing that word around? And so anyway, capitalism is one of those. And that's why we put the definitions at the front. But what I would say about capitalism is it was his idea to, no, let's really defend it, make it great. And so what we did is we kind of wrote a whole section on that. And in the book, we have this diagram where it shows all of politics is on one side. And then on the political side, there's a spectrum with fascism, they say is far right. And then communism is far left, for example. So we have this left and right divide within politics, but they're all the same. They're all central planned models. And then we drew capitalism all the way on the other side. It's not political. And so the point that we really tried to dig in and make is that capitalism itself is not a political modality. Socialism is, and communism is, and all these isms are, but capitalism is not a political modality, to the kind of point you already brought up. It's natural and emergent. So all humans, it's just part of life. And so because humans have a natural drive, a natural strive to invent, we have ingenuity, we have creativity, we want to use our scarce resources more efficiently. And so I would imagine the early cavemans, they carried one rock at a time. And then they're like, why am I carrying one rock at a time? I'll make a wheelbarrow and I'll carry 10 rocks at a time. And so we're always trying to create new ideas to become more efficient. That's capitalism. I'm using my private property, my body, my intellectual property. I'm using my private property to create something more efficient, right? And then I would imagine, then I figured out how to make a spear, right? By making a tip, and I threw at an animal, I killed that animal. And then I'm walking through with my dead animal and I see you and you have a fire. And I'm like, hey, you got a fire, I got a dead animal. Why don't I cook my animal on your fire and let's just share it, right? And that's capitalism. So it's private property rights, using scarce resources more efficiently, and free and voluntary exchange. And it happens all over. We're born knowing how to do this. This is just part of human nature. So little kids in preschool are trading chips and sandwiches, right? Even in the harshest authoritarian dictatorships like North Korea, there's still capitalism happening in black markets. Even in prisons, there's capitalism happening where they trade cigarettes for the onions out of the kitchen or something like that, right? So there's always capitalism. It's just part of natural humanity because humans have this drive. We have this strive to create, right? And so if that's natural and emergent, and that's just natural order, we have private property rights. Your body is your private property. What you build and create is your private property. And then there's two economic models for wealth. One is collaborative, and two is coercive. So I can either trade with you and collectively we could do better together, or I could beat you over the head and steal from you. Those are the two options. And so back to capitalism. Capitalism is me using my resources and my private property more efficiently, and then free trading with you. So the two of us can now collaborate and we can be multiplicative, right? So we can multiplicate our earnings. The sum is greater than the parts, right? Versus the other way is I can beat you over the head with a rock and I can steal from you, but that's subtractive. So now I'm not creating anything new between the two of us. I'm actually stealing from you and I'm not producing anything. And so those are the two models. And so basically what we argue is that, and I like to use this analogy, I broke it down yesterday for Peter. I look at like capitalism as this natural emergent process that humans engage in. And politics is like a parasite that attaches to it. And a parasite lives off of the productivity of the host, right? But the goal of a parasite is to extract what it needs without killing the host. And so I think that the first iterations we saw, with the Bolshevik Revolution in the 1917s in Russia, or, Hitler's Germany or East Germany, or, whatever, they killed the host. In China, they almost killed the host and the host realized it. And in the 80s, they opened up to a little bit of free trade, a little bit of capitalism, and parasite backed off a little bit and then allowed the host to kind of live. And so I look at politics as this parasite. It sucks the life out of the productive capitalist society.
Wow. And it opens up so many doors in terms of additional conversation. But the direction I'd like to go is that I never understood that central banking was literally in the Communist Manifesto.
Yeah.
It's written right there. And you're like, holy shit. And I've been in this kind of la land basically for most of my life, where I thought, growing up in the UK and now in Australia, I live in a place defined by free markets and I live in a liberal democracy and blah blah blah. Not true. I live in an economy run by a central bank, and the word capitalism, and put so nicely in UnCommunist Manifesto, it's actually crony capitalism. I'll say that again, crony capitalism. And this
or better even just to call it cronyism.
Cronyism, exactly. And this was typified by the COVID-19 bullshit that we've all been through, and the idea that there was someone who was the head of healthcare for the government who was like in so many obvious ways connected to the industry and the organizations profiting from the health advice that was being said that public health policy is more important than individual choice. And this happened around the world. And you're like, oh my God, how is this even working? And you suddenly realize that actually government's a representation of a bunch of extremely powerful different interest groups. And so I haven't necessarily experienced free markets or capitalism in the way that I thought I did. And your book just helps to really highlight that. You didn't mention, so what was the genesis for actually getting together with Alex? Was there a moment when you were like, fuck it, we've got to do something about this? Have you read the Communist Manifesto together or something? I don't know. How did that happen?
That's kind of what it was. I've been thinking about these ideas, capitalist ideas, freedom ideas for a long time, as I kind of gave you my backstory. I've read a lot about communism and socialism, a lot about the history of the Bolshevik Revolution, etc. I had just never actually read the Communist Manifesto. And so I'd read a lot about Marx. And I try to always go back to the source. Like people say, oh, so-and-so, this guy is so bad. It's like, well, what did he say that was bad? Have you actually heard him say any of that, or are you just reciting headlines, right? So like, I always want to go back to the source. I've read Klaus Schwab's books, The Fourth Industrial Revolution and The Great Reset. And I tell people, go read those books. I don't even want to tell you what's in them because it sounds so crazy. But anyway, I had never actually read his book. And it was during the 2020 situation when in the US, BLM was like rioting and burning down cities in the United States. And the head of BLM, this girl, she said, we're trained Marxists. That's what she said, like bragging about it, right? So I'm like, well, what does that mean? Like, what is a Marxist? So like, I should probably go to the source and I should probably read Karl Marx's book, the manifesto on it. And so I did. And by the way, it's a booklet. I recommend anybody to read it. If you're preparing for a debate, you're supposed to know your opponent's argument better than they do. Right. So I recommend everyone to go read it. It's about a 45-minute read. And some of the best books are Frederick Bastiat's The Law. Order that as well. And Murray Rothbard's Anatomy of the State. Both of those books are like less than an hour read, and you should read them. Anyway, so I got the book and I read it, and I was shocked. I was like, has anybody read this? Because if anybody read this, there's no way they would like these ideas.
Wow.
So they're a trained Marxist. You know, I saw there was a survey done at Yale like 2 weeks ago. I read it, and it said that they asked these college students what their preferred economic philosophy would be. And like, 60% of them said socialism. Wow. But it's like, do you really know what that is? And I think the answer isn't. So anyway, I had this idea. There's no way these people read this book, because if they read it, they wouldn't want this. And so then I thought, man, if we shined a light on this and people actually saw what was in it, maybe they wouldn't like these ideas like they think they do. And so then we were in El Salvador. I was down in El Salvador, and Alex and I were down there together, a group of us. And I brought the copy of the book, and I said, hey, Alex, have you ever read this book? And he said, no, I haven't either. And I told him, like, man, I can't believe people would like this if they did. And then, we kind of threw out the idea, like, maybe we should just rewrite it. And I think we could just rewrite it and just kind of flip the book on its head. And that was, I want to say that was like August of 21. And then I think it was maybe like December. He's like, hey, let's do it. Let's just do it. And so we basically just went into Austin, Texas, rented an Airbnb for like 5 days and just locked ourselves in there and just wrote it, just banged it out in like a week.
Awesome. I love that. And the creative process with someone else, like focused, couple days, and out comes a book. It's absolutely brilliant. Well,
it was brilliant. I'd read, just shout out, because I got inspiration. Jimmy Song they did a book sprint. I think Alex Gladstein, a couple of them got together and did this book sprint. And I read about this book sprint idea. And so I was kind of motivated by that. So anyway, shout out to those guys. But yeah, it's a brilliant way to do it. And I left that going, dang, I should almost go lock myself like a week, once a quarter to get work done, because it's amazing what you can do in a short period of time.
And actually that leads me nicely onto, so as someone, we've got some audience questions. I'll get to those in a minute, but as someone like myself, just starting out on the podcasting process, I want to build a business out of this podcast over the next, however many years it takes. How do you go about building your content? So what is your kind of creative workflow, and any advice to an aspiring content creator in this space?
Yeah, so sure, I can give a lot of that. I think first of all, the old cliche is, if you love what you do, you'll never work.
Yeah.
Which is a cliche, but I believe there's a lot of truth, and there's a lot of necessary truth.
I've read that a few times from a few people recently. You're like, what do I actually love doing? And I love talking to people, and especially about these kind of subjects. It's brilliant. Right. Like, oh my God, if this could be my job, then fucking bring it on.
Yeah. And the reason why that's important is because it's hard work. And you're never going to put all the effort and hard work in if you don't really love what you're doing. You want to ideally make money in something that you love. Now, I love surfing. I love riding dirt bikes. I love finance. Which one of those gives me the best options to make money with, right? And then you kind of pare it down. So I think about it in terms of those. As far as creating content, though, so first of all, you have to love what you're doing. You have to be absorbed into it. It's like, what are you already researching? What are you already doing for free? Now, it could be baking. Well, then great. Maybe you should do content about baking. Or traveling, or whatever it may be, right? So what are you already spending your time in doing? What do you already do for free? So I'd start there. I kind of had this rule when I first started making content that I never wanted to, my biggest fear, or I should just say, the thing I always wanted to do is I wanted to bring value with every single piece I did. So my biggest fear was that someone would watch a piece of my content and go, that was a waste of time. Like, I never wanted to do that. And I had people that would invite, hey, let's jump on your show. And I'm like, what are we going to talk about? They're like, I don't know. We'll just talk. I'm like, no, I ain't doing that. Like, I always want to make sure I'm bringing value to it. So I think it starts with that, like always making sure you're bringing value. As far as like what the process looks like, A lot of times people say they don't have like ideas, and we get ideas through taking in content. Right. So you're taking in content and then your brain's thinking about it and then you're reprocessing it. So I use an app on my phone and it's on my computer as well called Evernote. And I keep what's called like a capture page. And I basically just keep like a long running list of ideas. So anytime I have an idea, I just jot it down.
Yep.
And so if I'm listening to another podcast or another YouTube video, or I see a news headline or something like that, and it just, I get like this spark, and it could be when I'm in the shower or like when I'm in the kitchen or when I'm on a podcast or whatever, like I'll just stop and just kind of like write that down. So I try to keep kind of like a list of things. And then what I typically do when it comes to creating the content, and this is more for creating content, not so much interview podcasts. I'll get to that in a second. I'll typically start, so I'll have like the big idea, and then I'll typically put down like 8 to 10 bullet points. Because what you're trying to do with content is you're trying to get somebody from here to here. At least I am. I think that's how I bring value to people. Like, how can I help someone get through this thing? If you think about a book is they don't know anything about this to now they know about this, right? So what are the 5 or 6 things or 8 things they should know? And so that's how I think through it. What's the big idea? And then what are the things they need to know? Like right now, the video I'm going to try and record today when we're done is Bitcoin, not crypto. What does that mean? I did 2 videos on the whole FTX thing. And on my last video, I said, look, you should know by now, Bitcoin is not the same as crypto. And I got all these comments like, what does that mean? So I want to do a video on that. So what does that mean, right? Okay, what's the difference of a commodity? What's the difference of a security? What are the attributes of Bitcoin? Right? And so write down that. So anyway, that's kind of how I work. That's kind of my framework. And then I typically work off of bullet points so I can make sure I hit all my points. The podcasts are a little bit different when I do interviews, because that's more of like, what am I trying to learn at the time? And so like, if I can bring people on and learn from them, and I got this wrong for a while. It was actually Breedlove who kind of helped me think through this, right? Where I was bringing people on and asking them questions I thought my audience would want. And then I realized I'm blowing it, because I have access to like some of the brightest people in the space. Why am I not asking them the questions I want to know? Right? I was almost kind of dumbing it down. I hate to use that word, but almost like dumbing it down. I didn't want to talk too high level because I was trying to get to like beginners or whatever. And so Breedlove kind of helped me figure that out. And so I don't typically book out my interviews super far in advance. I kind of think about like what's timely, what's happening, what ideas am I wrestling with? And then I'll try to bring on experts and like talk through stuff that I have questions about. Stopping there, that's kind of how I create content for YouTube and interviews, kind of following those types of formats.
Because they're very much kind of 2 different things, aren't they? You've got the YouTube style broadcasting where you have a subject, a title, a bunch of things you want to talk about, and then however you might create that video in a studio like you are, or more with a mobile at home, depending on what kind of stage you've got to, and then actually interviews like this.
Yeah. So I actually have 3 types of content. So I have the YouTube videos, which are I'm really trying to bring a thesis. So the video I dropped last night on FTX was about how FTX might have been this deep state ploy to capture crypto. And so I take all this information from all these different sources and try to bring a thesis together, right? Or I make a video on what the central banks are going to do next. And it's this financial repression. And what does financial repression mean? When did they run it before? So I'm trying to bring like this thesis. So that's what the YouTube videos are. I also have a radio show, a nationally syndicated radio show, and I do that for 3 hours. But the radio, I have no visuals, and I'm typically by myself, and that's more like entertainment, edutainment kind of a thing, right? So then that's a different process, and then the interview. So there's different types of content, and I kind of have to think through them a little bit differently.
And then, of course, you're able to repost a lot of what you've created across different social media platforms to, that's where the eyeballs seem to be, basically. So that's
the next step.
Content, repurpose things to how people want them and understand how each platform works. I'm just kind of going through this process now. It's a big process of trial and error, basically. Like, what do people like, what people not like, what do you like?
So that's the syndication piece, right? So then you think about like your podcast or like my YouTube video is what I call a piece of pillar content. So I create the pillar, and then how can I repurpose that piece of pillar content into micro content, right? Syndicated content. So let's say for this interview right now, we've discussed 4 or 5 big topics. What drew me to Bitcoin, how money is evil, how Bitcoin brings it down, what capitalism is. And so each one of those topics could then be its own standalone piece of content. which would then also rank much better. Most of the algorithm ranking comes from the actual content of the video. So like they'll transcribe it and they'll figure out what it says and they'll place it.
Wow.
And so that's the most important thing. And the problem is, like on an interview like this, is that you may talk about a whole bunch of topics and then the algorithm doesn't really know what to do with it.
Cool.
Now, podcasts are different. Podcasts are mostly driven content. But what you'd want to do is then you would take these chunks out of your podcast and then put them onto Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, et cetera, right? Transcribe it, put it up on the blog, transcribe it, put it on LinkedIn, and those types of things.
Yeah, I need to work all this out. I'll get there eventually. So a shout out to my great mate, Jigsy, who helped introduce us in the first place when it was a year or so ago. And you recently released a video that I watched about Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter and like looking at his historical interest in payment networks and why he's actually doing it. And Jigsy's just intrigued. He says, do you think Elon actually believes in Bitcoin's pursuit of freedom? So anything to comment on there? And yeah, I'd be intrigued to know as well.
So obviously speaking out of opinion and not fact here, but I would say that I believe in his pursuit of freedom. I do. I don't believe in his pursuit of Bitcoin for freedom. So if you look at, he started PayPal in the beginning with Peter Thiel, and I've got the pleasure to meet Peter Thiel, and Peter Thiel gets it. He is like super based. He's an Ayn Rand disciple. And so I believe that I would imagine him and Elon Musk probably share some of those worldviews and values. So I think that Elon does really care about freedom of speech, et cetera. They started PayPal to be a new payment network, not part of the United States, not a faster way to send dollars, but an actual new monetary system. So I believe that's his intention from the beginning. So I do believe he believes in freedom of speech, freedom of money, et cetera. I do believe that's what he's pushing for. I just don't think he's put any amount of time in to really understand that Bitcoin is the only option for that. And so unfortunately, I think he's probably still going to try to pursue it with crypto at this point.
Okay, and that leads nicely back to this then. So you're going to sit down today and you're going to make a video about Bitcoin, not crypto.
Yeah.
So I actually probably won't release this interview for another 4 weeks. So, people go and watch that
Okay.
first. But what is the gist of Bitcoin, not crypto?
So the gist of Bitcoin, I had the pleasure of having dinner with Michael Saylor just this last Saturday night, and we talked about this quite extensively. And he was kind of the one that kind of helped me frame this up a little bit. But basically, well, from a bigger standpoint, before I talk about what he said, but from a bigger standpoint is, what are the attributes of it, right? So why gold, not steel or aluminum or platinum or palladium? Well, because they're just different. What do you mean they're different? Well, they have different characteristics, right? Gold is made up of different chemical properties than aluminum or alloy, right? And so gold also has different properties than crypto. One of the key pieces that Michael Saylor helped me kind of realize is that Bitcoin is one of the only digital assets that was not issued. So a commodity, think oil, think gold, think wheat, those are commodities. I can go buy a piece of land and I can mine for gold. I can go buy a piece of land and pump for oil. I can go buy a piece of land and I can grow wheat, but there's no central issuer of wheat or gold or oil. And just like I can go buy land and get any of those three commodities, I can also go buy a computer and I can mine Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is a commodity. It's a digital asset that has no issuer. There's no company, no marketing department. There's no governing body, no governance, no DAO, no steering committee. It's just Bitcoin, right? Unlike, and I've been corrected on Twitter, so there's a couple other cryptos that I've also had that as well, but then you have to start looking at the other stuff. In the US, the SEC, Securities Exchange Commission, as well as the CFTC, they haven't really given us clear guidance on what else is a security, but, and I'm no securities exchange attorney, but according to, the Howey test, et cetera, Ethereum looks like a security to me because it has a founder who issued a token. 70% of the Ethereum tokens were in the pre-mine. They issued them.
Crazy when you start looking into this,
And there's a steering committee. There's a group that controls it. They just changed the consensus mechanism. They have a 10-year roadmap. Ethereum is a software company, and it should be a security. Now, let me just say this to everyone listening. I am not for government regulation. I don't think we should have an SEC at all, and I don't think we should have the security regulation. I think it should all be gone, but it is what it is, and we have it. And so using that, if you have a company founded and issued a token, that seems like a security to me. And so I think that's like the big difference. Bitcoin is a digital commodity. Everything else are companies and their securities, and they're probably going to be regulated as such, which I'm going out on a limb to say that I think we might have seen the last crypto bull run.
Wow. Interesting. Yeah, it strikes me as back in 2017, 18, I did some angel investing and I was looking for early stage clean technology companies in London, working with a syndicate. There was 100 different angels in the syndicate looking for these little tech companies. And the type of business that we were looking at, that's what these early stage crypto tokens are. You know, they're early stage projects. They've got founders. They're somewhere in the world. They've got a supposed mission. Obviously, the FTX debacle breaks open the discussion as to like whether or not these have, you know, genuine interests in helping people and building what they actually claim to be doing, and whether or not the whole thing's just a massive fraud. But the point being is Bitcoin is a different beast entirely to, generally speaking, what's going on in the 20,000 other coins. And people don't realize that. You know, you get onto Coinbase or whichever other large exchange you go onto, and there's all these different options that you can buy, and then they're there on purpose. The exchanges make money from you buying and selling these things, not from just buying Bitcoin and disappearing self-custody. So it is a really important definition to make. And I think that over time, you know, maybe 5 years from now, it'll be really obvious that it's like Bitcoin, not crypto. But at this stage, it's very, very difficult to separate them. And people always say to me, "Oh, you started a crypto podcast," and I'm so deep into the Bitcoin space. I'm like, "No, mate, it's Bitcoin podcast." And they're like, "What is that? What do you mean?"
I think there's a couple other things that I'll just draw some attention to. So I think one, understanding how this system works. I said I had some experience in this. I have a very good. I don't want to dox him, but a very good relationship with somebody, one of my good friends, who last year launched a token with Alameda and FTX. So I was there, I witnessed the whole thing. And basically the way it works is he had this idea for this decentralized protocol, and he hired a couple of developers on Upwork, and he developed it, and he sold to Alameda, and they made 100 million tokens. Alameda took 30% of those tokens, issued him a check for $6 million, and then gave him $6 million in tokens back. So $12 million he got. Then Alameda flips them to their VCs at 6 cents and 9 cents. Then the VCs turn them and dump them at 12 cents and 26 cents. So typically VCs, like you're saying that you did some of that angel investing, typically a VC, you invest into Uber, and it takes you 7 to 10 years before there's a liquidity event. So typically a VC fund might invest into 10 to 15 projects, and there's like a 7 to 10 year lockup on that. You invest into Uber, but until there's a liquidity event, which means that either got bought out or it went public, you can't get your money out. The VCs loved this because they could put money in, have instant liquidity, and like 10x their money by selling a bunch of smoke and mirrors to retail. And they were creating this value around it. And then they were literally making hundreds of millions of dollars at 10x valuations. So they loved it. So then they were pumping all this money into media, into marketing, into parties. And then because there's so much hype around it, then they put it on an exchange like FTX, and then everybody wanted to trade it because they thought there was value, because a bunch of VCs put money into it, because Alameda created a fake market around it. But there was never anything there. Back to my good buddy who did this, he created a decentralized protocol. What does that mean? That means he released the code, wiped his hands off, and there's no company. There's no development team. He's done. I created a decentralized protocol. Have at it, boys. And like, that's it. And so everyone loved it. And they dumped hundreds of millions of dollars into the media, the marketing, and to bring attention to it. If they weren't able to do that, if it was like traditional VC where they had to lock up money for a decade, you wouldn't have all this investment. It wouldn't be there. We can see this because look at Bitcoin. So there's lots of projects being built on Bitcoin. I consult for Trammell Venture Partners, TVP. I'm an advisor for them. And it's a Bitcoin only venture fund.
Really,
and these companies that are building real products that like actually work on Bitcoin have to go get money from real investors with real dollars, right? And so that changes everything. The other thing the other thing I would say is back to some of the differences of Bitcoin and crypto is the revolution here is decentralization. That's the revolution. We have the whole internet. I talked about I was there in the early days of the internet. And what happened is the internet was very hard to use in the beginning. I told you I started an internet business in 1999. I thought I was going to get super rich on with this big exit. And I literally had to set up a rack server in my office with 2 servers with hot swappable hard drives because there was no cloud hosting at the time. But most people didn't want to do that. It was too expensive. It was too hard. And so we got cloud hosting and we got all this centralization that happened. Today, we see the problems of this. right? We see Facebook and the problems with Google centralizing our data. And so now the revolution is decentralization. Of course, Satoshi Nakamoto solved the Byzantine generals problem. That's the revolution. And because the Bitcoin database has been kept small, you can run the entire code set on a thumb drive. Anyone in any part of the world with a 5-year-old laptop can run a Bitcoin node. And so the database is decentralized because anybody with any amount of money in any part of the world can run a database. They can run a node, but you can't do that with the other 20,000 cryptocurrencies. So there's the decentralization aspect of it. None of those have achieved that. And then the other thing I would say to it is that people say, well, what's it backed by? So first of all, that's like a fiat term. So paper gold certificates or dollars were backed by the gold in the bank. So if I gave you the dollar certificate, you can go to the bank and claim the gold. Debt is backed by something, right? Debt is. What's gold backed by? Gold is not backed by anything. What's oil backed by? Oil is not backed by anything. Only debt is backed by something. So first of all, it's a very fiat term. But today people would say, since the dollar is not backed by gold anymore, they'd say, well, the dollar is backed by the full faith and credit of the government. Or more what they would say is that it's backed by the military.
Backed by guns, yeah.
By guns, right? So if anybody tries to uproot the dollar, then the U.S. military will come after them, kind of a thing, right? Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein, whatever. So if you think about it like that, so then it's backed by the military. So the power, the force and power that the military could exert. So if you take the Navy, and I got this part from Michael Saylor, so shout out to him. But if you take the Navy, we have nuclear submarines and nuclear Air Force carriers, right? And all the power in the Navy. And you measure power in like kilowatt hours or megawatts or gigawatts. So the American Navy is about 4.5 gigawatts of power. So that's the power that's backing the dollar, 4.5 gigawatts. The Bitcoin network has a computer network that uses power as well. And it's using about 10 gigawatts of power.
Wow.
So if the dollar is backed by 4.5 in the Navy, well, Bitcoin's backed by 10. Okay. Well, that's the power. What's using the power? Well, computers. So computers are measured in hash power. And if you take all the cloud hosting platforms like Microsoft Azure and Amazon AWS, et cetera, and you take all the hash power of those, you would call it equihash, and then you compare that to the computing power of the Bitcoin network. The Bitcoin network has 10 times the amount of computer hash power that all the other computer power has in the world.
Wow.
So if you wanted to attack Bitcoin, I was asked this question earlier today, if you want to attack Bitcoin, how could you do it? So China and the US goes and prints $10 trillion and they're going to build out these mining centers. Well, where are they going to get the equipment? It's going to take them 5 years to build it. And then if they build it, where do they plug them in? Are they going to build nuclear reactors for it? Well, by gun, they go take it over. But whatever, I don't want to go down that road. But the point is there's 10 gigawatts of power, 10 times the equihash hashing power. What does the 20,000 other cryptocurrencies have? 3 guys in a basement staking a couple coins?
It's just not even comparable, is it? Wow. And even just that story about your friend who managed to get $6 million for, a couple of guys on Upwork and a decentralized protocol. I mean, that's a huge amount of money for an early stage 3-man team that just doesn't even, if you're buying an actual equity position in an early stage company, then you'd be asking serious questions if you wanted $6 million for it. Yeah.
But the bigger point is it's not a company. There's no team. They wrote the protocol, they created the token, and it's gone. There's no development. Wow. There's no company. There's no team. There's no early investment.
What does get my brain going is how does, let's say Andreessen Horowitz, one of the most famous VCs of today, who has pumped undoubtedly millions of dollars into these crypto tokens. How do they get around that from a regulatory perspective when they're raising real dollars into these funds? There's going to be some court cases surely that come out of this because it just they haven't been buying things that are appropriate for those funds, surely.
I agree with that statement. Now, again, I have to say, like, I'm all for getting rid of the SEC. I'm not for pandering for regulations, but in the environment that we have, I agree. FTX was the largest donor for the Democratic Party.
I know, it's crazy.
They gave $40 million for this last election. Should those people give back those stolen funds? We know now that FTX stole those funds from customers. Should the Democratic Party give that money back? So to your point, yes, I would agree, but who knows what's going to happen with that?
No, who knows? And I agree. I take more and more of a stance of like, just let people get on with it and leave them the fuck alone. Anyway, people corrupt systems, and it's very, when you go down that hole of sound money, etc., you start to see it everywhere as to how it affects people.
The bigger problem is it was actually Lynn Alden that turned me on to this. I like to give credit to people who give me these ideas, but I was talking to her this last weekend at the Pacific Bitcoin conference, and she said, if you look at all the crypto, it's really like a denial of service attack against Bitcoin. So a DDoS attack is basically where you spam a server, and the server then gets clogged up with all the spam, right? And so if you think about all these cryptocurrencies are DDoS attacks against Bitcoin. So all these new people come into the space, they go and they want to buy Bitcoin or they want to buy
attention goes
cryptocurrency.
Elsewhere.
They go elsewhere, and all that money flows into all these other assets. And Bitcoin has to go through one by one by one, and each one's a fraud. Each one's a fraud, right? So I think, as I said, I kind of already made the case. I think we may have seen the last crypto bull run, and the reason why I say that is because I think this is enough to finally get the regulators to come and put the boot down. And again, I'm not asking for it, but I think we will. And so I think these companies will have to register as securities or shut down. I think the majority of them will disappear. Some of them will jump in and become securities. Most will go away. Once that happens, it's going to be very clear what Bitcoin is and what cryptocurrencies are. And we're not going to have 20,000 other cryptos pulling money away. So imagine 90% of the money in crypto moving into Bitcoin. What happens?
That's very bullish, isn't it? Yeah. Well, just lots of extra demand on a fixed supply asset. It's very exciting. That's precisely why we're buying and accumulating Bitcoin.
And we have these crypto casinos like FTX, which are technically breaking the law. And I think those will go away because then they'll have to register as a securities exchange. And when they register as a security exchange, they'll have to meet the regulations that go along with that. So for example, not trading your own book. That's what they did. They traded their own book, right? So you can't do that. And when you do that, also like really having the assets you're supposed to have. So we saw with FTX, they had 1.1 Bitcoin, 1.1 worth 20,000 US dollars against 1.4 billion of Bitcoin claims.
Jeez.
So
that's crazy, isn't it?
So they were selling paper Bitcoin. So imagine that 1.4 Bitcoin, it was taking away demand. That 1.4 should have been actually into real Bitcoin. What would that do to the price? And so when you get rid of all these exchanges that are selling fake paper Bitcoin, and we can bring real supply and demand back to the ecosystem, what does that do?
Yeah, it's very bullish, isn't it? And that's that conversation about the derivative products of Bitcoin that are being sold, dampening the actual demand. Well, Mark, listen, over an hour has now flown by. Thank you so much for sharing all of your amazing information and your personal journey. Where can people reach out and get in touch if they want to?
Yeah, like I said, I mean, I'm on a bunch of different platforms. You can just search, just go to onemarkmoss.com is my website, onemarkmoss.com. And I have everything linked there. But YouTube, Mark Moss, podcast, Mark Moss, radio, Mark Moss. And I'm way too active on Twitter. So hit me a message there and let me know what you're thinking. And I always try to reply to you there.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, friends, nice work. You made it all the way to the end of the episode. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this conversation. As I said at the start, if you have any questions, then please don't hesitate to reach out. And if you enjoyed the episode, then please rate, like, subscribe, and share. That's it for now. Enjoy the rest of your day. All the best, Jake.